Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Great to be here. And Tathagat, I think you covered quite some interesting areas in managing the areas of untraditional project management and disruptive areas. So you have a very wonderful topic, and what I'm hoping to do is possibly a half an hour presentation, and maybe we'll get about 10-15 minutes for Q&A, right? So I think let's look forward maybe to give you some food for thought, and before you go to the real thing, the lunch, and have some actionables that you can take forward to your work and your project management life, right? So the topic I'm addressing is blind spot in digital transformation initiatives. So I know many of you, being so much in depth into the project management field, there are a lot of digital elements that you would be doing, right? In many ways, I guess IT is so embedded into many of the projects and work that we do that really speaking, there's no standalone projects without an IT component coming in, right? So this is what I aim to cover. So about what project management is in the new normal, the digital transformation, what does it imply, and addressing the blind spots, right? Because I know as PMIPCC, there's been a lot of area covered on the ways in which to ensure your project management, the budget, time, and quality is ensured, right? So what is it that the disruptive aspects of digital brings into play that possibly you need to factor in? So at a very basic level, this is a situation that all of us are facing, whether in India or the globe. There's a huge demographic upheaval in the sense we actually working with multi-generational workforce, right? So on the very senior end, you have the baby boomers, and many of them, if they're in the private or own segments, they'll be working all the way up to post-60s into maybe the late 60s as well. Then you have Gen X, right? And then you have the millennials, who we call our native bred, right? They're born with the smartphones in their hands. And now increasingly we have Gen Z coming in. So Gen Z generation is something like youngsters age grouped 18 plus, right? So your millennials are in the range of 25, about around that range. So in many ways, it's a very unique situation that the baby boomers have not gone out of the workforce, and at the same time you have the millennials coming in. So if you add the millennials and the Gen Z together, we're talking about nearly 40-50% of your workforce, right? So these are people who are very comfortable on smartphones, social. They actually can't imagine a time when you had rotary dials, right? I know, I'm sure that many of you also can't, but there are a lot of us who can still figure out those days when, you call up a board and then, ask for a call to a specific person. Digital technology, yes, everywhere. That word is a lot used every now and then, but we'll just take a look at what exactly do we mean that. And rate of change has accelerated. So we know change has always been there, right? I mean, right from the industrial age in the 18th century, 19th century, change has always been happening. Technology has been coming in. But now I think the huge element is the speed at which things are changing is much more, right? If you look back 5 years, 10 years back, in fact, recently I think in the media you have seen the 10th anniversary of the iPhone. 2007 doesn't seem that long back, right? In fact, when it first came, there was a lot of questions on, what did Steve Jobs think? In this world of Nokias and Blackberries, he's coming without a keyboard and all those facilities. But now we know that it actually reshaped the whole smartphone experience. And some of those names are not anymore there in the industry now. And the last one is the social contract between employees and work there's been a lot of change. So in one extent, you see a lot of startups coming into the fore, right? They're saying, okay, we will define what we want to do with our knowledge, our skills. And on the other side, the last, I think, few months, we have seen in IT service industry, there's been a huge upheavals, right? Almost everywhere in India and the global parts, there are these uncertainties of whether it is, you talk about the L1 or otherwise, and that especially applies to countries like us. But even areas where new employment is coming in. So you see a lot of changes happening in. And many times, they could be coming in from the political side or it could be social or technological side. Okay, this is just an anecdote which I really experienced myself. I'm based out of Bangalore, and I was, traveling down south, and there was an emergency, so couldn't get any flights or trains, so I decided, okay, let me take a bus. And on a Friday, Bangalore, the bus, there are plenty of them, but getting in one is something else, right? So I went to Madiwala, the Koramangala area, tried all the tricks I could get, no ways, Friday with a long weekend in. So finally, the last one that came in was going to leave at around 11:30. So I went and told the conductor, he said, sorry, it's all full. So I said, why don't you give me the seat the cleaner sits, right? The boy next to the driver. So he said, I'll charge you the full rate. I said, fine, just give me a seat. So he gave me the seat in. Now, you know how the seats are there. They're not the cushioned back one, they're straight, flat ones. But the interesting thing was, it was a huge experience, right? Because you typically don't sit next to the driver on an overnight trip. So about 1.5 hours down the road, what happened was, there was a knocking sound coming up from the engine side. So I was just watching what was the thing that they're going to do. So, and mind you, the cleaner boy, who's assistant for the driver, is sitting right next to him on the floor, and they have this long conversation that goes on. I mean, I think that's the way that they keep the driver awake, right? So many times when we are sitting in the back, we never realize all the things that may be happening on the other side, with the driver is doing. So this discussion happened, should we really, look into it? Is that really a problem? And the next thing the cleaner boy, he must be somewhere in the 17 or 18, he whips out his mobile phone and he says, let me check who of the maintenance is, now mind you, this is around past midnight, right? So he looks into it and he says, oh, this, maintenance guy, he's still up. Let me just give him a call and find out, can he give us some guidance? So he calls him up and he says this is a symptom, and the mechanic on the other side says, there is a stop coming up, I'll come in my bike, so let me take a look at the bus at that point. And correctly after half an hour, the bus stops, the mechanic comes in, and what he does is he first listens to it, he still can't identify, so he brings out his laptop, right? And he connects it into the dashboard. And now he runs the whole thing. And you can see on the side, all the scorecard and all that is happening. And then he says, okay, there is this valve which is being pointed out by the software. So the next thing you know, they close, they have this flat board for rolling under the bus, right? Because it's pretty muddy on the road. So they both roll under the bus, they go check, and then they come back and say, yes, I think some water has gone into the valve. It's not a problem. And they enter some data into the computer, and the bus goes on. Now, the point I wanted to say was, this is actually digital at work, right? And we're talking about a very simple, normal bus. We normally wouldn't think when we say digital in those terms, right? So many times, you may not be actually feeling that, yeah, you're on a digital situation, but you're actually, encountering that a little step behind, right? So the point was, if it's something as simple as getting into a bus and the mechanic does a digital intervention, then you can imagine what the situation would be, whether it's a hospital or a government service or any of them. Okay, so we said what is digital. In fact, the usual term that is often used is SMAC. SMAC stands for S for social, mobile, A for the analytics, C for the cloud. Now, in fact, that acronym has got slightly expanded. It's called SMACs. You have S at the end that represents the sensors and a security that goes across all of them, right? So here the big data in a way connects into the sensor parts or the Internet of Things, those elements. So here if you take, for example, in the bus, you have the guy in the mobile. He uses social to find where the mechanic is available. The algorithm did, a check with the cloud-based data that is there on the problems that was there and identified where the problem is. And the sensors on the valve said exactly which valve, where it was having the problem. So that's why I said all the components are there in the bus scenario that I mentioned. Now, when we say digital transformation, I know transformation is a very loosely used word. Everything is a transformation, right? But what we are saying about when we say digital transformation is actually a new ways of thinking and working, right? So technology is just one part. There's a little difference in the way we work, and that definitely has an impact even on project management when we see further down. And equally well, there has to be a radical value realization on the business or customer side, right? So if you're making incremental benefits, nice, but that is not digital transformation, right? It would involve a rethinking of many of the things that is being done within this context. And it's not necessary that you need to have all the pillars of the digital to be used there. So there could be certain case like, for example, it's just social, mobile, and analytics. It's a digital intervention. There could be something else that has the sensors plus the mobile or the cloud coming in. So there could be different mixes of the technologies being used, right? So effectively, what has been happening is late 90s, we had the email, the internet in 94 started off, the emails came in. 2000s, 2004 onwards, about Facebook, social media came into play, and you start having about 2 billion of the population on the, in fact right now I think it's almost touching 3 billion. So half the population on earth has a social presence, right? And increasingly now we are going to go into about 20 plus billion of things in terms of sensor based connections. So it could be your morning toaster, or it could be your car, or it could be when you're swiping into your office, your security point. So all of this, there's a lot of data being generated, and what we know and what we do not know, there's a lot of digital happening in the back end. So let me give a few case examples. I mean, you could call some of them as caseless, but just to drive the point that, okay, the technology, this is what it is, but what does it impact on the other side? Now, this was a typical challenge that the New York Times faced in terms of, they had a lot of print articles which have been scanned and available with them, about 11 million archived things that they wanted to put online and make it searchable, make available to others, right? Now, what they did was they defined the problem and they took Amazon Web Services, cloud compute network storage elements were taken, and the whole thing was done over a weekend, right? Now, I know that sounds quite a huge leap, right? We know typically what you see on the top is a typical procurement cycle, right? You design, you set out the requirement specs, you give it to the procurement team, they order in the servers, the configure, the IT team comes and set up the OS and the applications on top of it, the storage, everything is connected in, and then only you get it. So typically that would take about 4 to 6 months. So here what we find is they just tied up with, I'm just giving AWS as an example, not promoting Amazon per se, but this particular case happened with them. right? But the whole point is the compute, storage, and the network, all of it was just used for the that conversion period, which was done over the weekend, and the whole thing was released. So it was $2,000 odd was what was spent for that whole work, right? And why I'm showing that graphics out there is, in digital, it impacts either on scope, that's the binoculars there. It could be a scale impact. There is a speed element and the rupees for the spend. So different use cases, some of them impacts all the four, some of them will be for some of them. This is another one called Animoto, which is basically a social, a video conversion tool. So what it does is it takes up all your photos, puts them into a video with some music, and you can upload on your Facebook or any other thing. So what you see is that initially they just had 40 instances, but suddenly when they put this, with the linkage into social media, the requirement went up to 5,000 instances because it became very popular. And all of this was managed on the cloud to scale up. So here you see scale and speed being managed. So that's what we're indicating there. This is a little more closer home. We're all familiar with IRCTC, right? In fact, I'm very sure that many of you may not remember when was the last time you went to a counter to buy a ticket, right? If you remember that experience, you would know that if you're not very sure about, you're standing right at the counter and you're asking for a ticket and the inspector says, sorry, the ticketer says, sorry, this is not available. And usually you have that 30 seconds, 1 minute before somebody is jabbing from the back, if you don't know what ticket you want, please move to the side, right? And that's a huge pressure thing because you waited for nearly an hour to come to the front of the queue and now otherwise you have to go right to the back. And today what do? We are going online. So if you see in 2007, 32,000, I know the font may be a little small for the people in the back. But in 2014, it had increased 100 times. And in fact, the latest one says about 650,000, are the e-tickets being issued per day. We know we have our problems, right? When you go in for Tatkal window or you're trying to do the capture, right? There's a lot of pain there. But still the whole point is there's a huge transition, right? I mean, any time of the day, you log in and you can decide to do a transaction. So don't leave Indian Railways at that point alone. If you see, what they've also done is there's an IRCTC Air, right? I'm sure 5 years back, no one would have taken odds saying that Indian Railway is going to be in the air tickets business, right? But now they've tied up on that. And the one on the bottom is package deals that they do end-to-end, including your stay, travel, the works. So I'm just saying that businesses are getting changed even very close to where we are. So now let me take a look at what are the project management impacts. So till now we covered the digital elements, what were the changes and what are the things that are happening. Now typically there are two types of risks. So I'm using a yin-yang because it actually goes together sometimes. You have some intrinsic risk. So when I say intrinsic risk, this is what I mean. That is more within the control of your project management team, or that's within your scope to handle, right? And then you have the extrinsic risks. So I'll dive a bit deeper into each of them. What do I mean? Right? The extrinsic risks are, for example, stakeholder differences. There are more outside your direct impact, but there are ways in which you can work on. That's why you see in the the dark side there's a small white circle within, which means it is not totally out of your control. There are ways in which you can manage those areas too. So just going back to the bit of basics. I know when you introduced the blind spot aspect, you said that in driving we're always careful, right? Because a vehicle that comes on a blind spot, and blind spot is not only for driving, it's any time of, it's a permanent thing. It's a human part. In fact, there are certain experiments by which you can do and identify a blind spot while you're sitting somewhere. But the thing is, we have got so used to it and compensating for it that we don't, actually logically keep thinking of a blind spot. But blind spot is where the optic nerve is going out of the retina, right? And that's where there are no sensors. And that's why the blind spot happens in the eye. Now the point is, blind spot is also a management situation, right? There are many times when the things that you never expected. For example, I'm sure that if somebody asked, would Donald Trump win? I'm sure that, with all the amount of issues and the brickbats that the media gave, and the big question was, what majority was Hillary Clinton going to win, right? And then you suddenly find in the morning that no, the situation is totally different. So I'm just saying that that's a political blind spot, right? You didn't expect something like that to happen, and now that's a reality. So let me now come to why looking at the blind spot a bit closer. So typically in your eye, at the back of the retina, the sensing is done by rods and cones. That's what the retina is made up of. Now the interesting thing is, the cones that you see in that red, green, blue is what is sensitive to light. Right? So whenever you see an image, whenever you see color, it's your cones in the eye that are getting triggered. And that's what's sending signals to the brain. Right? Rods are color insensitive, but they are very sensitive to movement. So now the interesting thing is, in your eye, there are 6 million cones and there are 120 million rods. So we're talking about a 20:1 ratio, right? Now that means the elements that you're using to see color is a very small part. It's just the cones. And the whole other thing about what you're seeing on the side on the movement is actually the rods, which is 20 times more. Now that's because the evolution found that rods was a very important thing for you, right? When you were out in the jungle, or your ancestors were in the jungle, it was very important for you to sense if there is some threat coming from the side and you need to do something on it. Now, the interplay of this with an organization or in project management is, we often look at, this is our direct vision, what we use with our codes. We look at project management from a time, scope, budget perspective, right? We call it, in short, the triple constraints. So you would say, whatever you do, don't let scope creep happen, right? You need to manage within the time, the budget that is there. So what I'm trying to say now is, in a disruptive situation, this framework is not adequate. Well, actually, it can sometimes get into trouble, right? So that's where, so I'm saying that this is this is important in the sense, yeah, you need to manage them, but that is not the complete answer. It is just like saying that, just perceiving color doesn't make your eyesight full, right? You have to perceive color and you have to isolate the movement. They're equally important. So this is the other part that you need to bring in when you work with disruptive technologies, project management. To make it easy for you to remember the items, think of NTPC, right? I'm not talking so much, but NTPC is something, as Indians, we are familiar with the corporate, right? So it basically stands for novelty, technology, pace, and complexity. So usually what happens is, when we try to manage disruptive projects, and digital or any other, you need to have a view into this area. Now I'll give you an example where it actually played out in real life. This is Denver International Airport project, which was a huge project that was done in the US. Now what they did was, they wanted to build a new airport because United Airlines said that our second hub we'll give you in Denver if you can make a latest modern airport, right? Because we're going to have a lot of people coming in. And United is one of the largest airlines in the US. So the Denver team said, no problems, we'll get you the latest thing. So they took up a project on building a new airport, and along with that, they were quite ambitious, and they said, we will also give you a very modern baggage handling thing. So when passengers come in, the turnaround by which they can go out will be very fast. So, the airlines were very happy, please do that, that's great. Now, what happened was, 2.5 years down after the whole project happened, the airport construction went pakka. It met time, budget, scope. But they couldn't operate the airport at that time because the baggage handling system didn't work out. So you can imagine in an airport, everything else is working, but the baggage handling system doesn't work. You're as good as paralyzed, right? You can't get any passenger to come in and say, we don't know where the baggage is. So what happened was this. The airport construction project followed this mix. That is, in terms of, so let me just elaborate what are the components in each of those axes. So on the novelty that you see, the first is a derivative. That means it is a slight improvement on something that you're doing, right? That's what a derivative is. A platform means, yeah, it is a new thing, but it is from a known mix of technologies. And breakthrough is when there is some radical, developments being done. So that's the novelty element. On technology element, you have low tech, medium tech, high tech, and super high tech. Now what happens is, low and medium we can understand, right? The high tech is something that is new, but it is known in the industry, right? There's been enough work done on that. But the super high tech is where, it's a totally new thing. Maybe a blockchain, maybe some totally new area that is coming into that corporate or the industry. Now, the complexity, you have assembly, systems, and array. I hope maybe at the back, I know how easy it is to read the font. Now, assembly is basically putting together the modules, right? You make them and then you work it together. System is when a little more larger, complex modules are involved. And array stands for different types of technologies working together, right? Now, pace, basically you can have a regular pace. That means, yeah, the business as usual speed of getting things done. You have fast competitive, something that has to come out has to be very fast. Time critical. The CEO or somebody says this has to happen at this time, otherwise it doesn't make sense. And then you have blitz. Now, blitz is when, let's say, a disaster situation, right? You're not prepared for it, but you have to react very fast, you have to get things done. So that gives you an idea of how the different elements of the axis look. So here what happened was, the airport construction project was a platform in terms of novelty. It's a known technology mix as it is. It was elements of low tech and medium tech were there. It was, from a complexity perspective, an array because you have a lot of different systems that have to work together, right? And the pace, yes, it was fast competitive. Now what happened was, the automatic bag handling system was a high-tech technology. There are a lot of new technology coming in, right? It was a systems-based, it was a platform, and the speed, everything else was same. But the problem that the Denver team had was they treated the baggage handling system the same way they treated the airport construction project, right? Now the whole point here is, when you have situations like these, there are different ways in which you manage a certain type of complex projects versus another. So if the diamond is coming within the main one, you're not at risk. But at any point it crosses the other one, there's a chance that you're going to have headaches, problems away from that. Right? So this is where the NTPC framework will start coming of use. I'll dive a bit more deeper. But this is just to say that you get that wrong, you could get into trouble when you're handling disruptive projects. So when you're doing a project management, especially if you're coming into some new areas, you need to take a look at this area. Now, innovation categories and project types. So typically incremental market innovation is, you can see, is derivative and platform related ones, right? Radical market innovation is where there are breakthrough work involved. So in your own projects and companies where you're working, you may have different mix of it. By and large, there may be incremental market innovation. There could be a few which is radical innovation related. And then on the complexity side, you have modular innovation and architectural innovations, right? So if you're going to work on an array area, which is a lot of multiple different things, then you could very often be an architectural innovation area. And this is incremental technology innovation, radical technology innovation, which I think is quite intuitive. Right? So these are some of the implications of depending on where you are on this axis. For example, if you're going to work on high technology or ultra high technology, then your design freeze may need to come later in the cycle, right? Because there are points coming in. So typically systems engineering, system integration are some of the ways in which you handle these two parts. Pace and autonomy, right? Now I'm sure you may not remember all the different components on the axis, but pace at the bottom end is a blitz one. That means the disaster management one is like that. So in a disaster situation, you need to give more autonomy to your teams on the ground. So while you may work with teams in a particular way, you need to know that if a crisis situation comes, what is the structure of autonomy you're going to give to the team is going to be critical. So this is not required for all the situations, but you can't expect a team to respond adequately on a blitz situation if your autonomy is restricted. And novelty part. So typically your market data may not be available, so you need to do your freeze based on those elements. I'm going slightly fast, but maybe some of these inputs I'll share later. So this typically shows, depending on the type, you see the A, B, C, D are the type of tech of the project. At what stage should you freeze the requirements? And how many design cycles would you need? Right? So now we are going into the specifics. We are saying, okay, you have a breakthrough project or you have a simple array project happening in. Now this decides how it impacts into your requirement freeze, your design cycles, elements of that. Right? So those were the intrinsic risks. So this is just to give you an idea that, okay, you're working on disruptive, on the project management part, there is an area that you may need to bring in which you may not have done earlier. Now, extrinsic risk, stakeholder needs difference. So I think I have another 5 minutes, so okay, right. See, this is a situation that happens when technology complexity has been going up. Many times, the business is not able to interpret technology. Right? So as technical, as project management people, you need to be able to bridge that gap. Because earlier when technology was simpler, they could understand, they know, okay, I know what you're saying. But many times they may not realize, what are the implications of certain decisions that they're taking at this point. Right? There are structural shifts involved. What I mean to say is, I'm sorry it's a little difficult to read behind, but the first two blocks are finance and production related. That's the typical ERP related areas. If you're in the IT area, then you will relate with that. And the other three are more front-end facing, right? Marketing, customer support parts. So what you see in the colored blocks are, what relates to BI, collaboration and other elements that you need to handle. So what this implies is, typically, I know I'm giving more examples of IT here, but I know many of you may not be IT specific persons. See, systems of records is where, like a ERP system, you have all data, all structured data, right? But systems of engagement is where it's more driven by interactions, right? So there's a lot more importance coming into systems of engagement. Now, this is what it means in terms of the mix of your team in your project management, right? So what you see on the left side is the traditional project management, where 80% is made up of development, testing, middleware, legacy teams, and the other part was industry expertise and user experience. But now the change that has come in is 50% is going into domain and user experience part. The user experience part is now becoming very critical, right? So any disruptive thing, if it's not getting used, is as good as not being there. So you need to, this is the quantification in terms of what that impact means when you need to handle systems of engagement. This I'll just quickly go through, because you keep hearing every now and then there's a lot of data being generated, right? We talk about exabytes, petabytes and all that. But the reality of the situation is, like this is an oil rig data, about 30,000 sensors, only 1% of the data gets used. The data gets lost because either you can't store it, you can't transmit it, or it doesn't come real time. So there are different ways the data leaks out. So when you're interacting with your business, you may need to factor in these parts. Yeah, generating data is easy, but are you able to use it? Another thing which I think nowadays we don't need to say after, the situation of WannaCry and all those cyber risks that we've been seeing, right? These are some of the 10 major data breaches that have happened across history in IT. Now the interesting part is 7 of them happened in the last year, right? I think you may have heard about the Yahoo breach, Dropbox, LinkedIn, and if you see, all of these are social media platforms we use. A data breach is one of the costliest things for an enterprise because you're basically getting the user data going in somewhere, right? So what this means is that your security is not to be kept for another department. If you remember about people who worked 15 years back would remember saying that quality is not a department, quality is every man's or woman's job. Now today that applies to security. Security is not a department out there. Security is something each employee needs to factor in. Because the weakest link is where you can have problems coming in. Right? So that is, I know we have time for questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Ajit. That was a very interesting session. When there was one slide which was really very, very relevant. I grew up in Mumbai. And for more than 25 years, we were there. So when my dad used to book tickets for coming to Hyderabad, he used to stand in the queue almost from 5:30 a.m. So imagine how he had to travel for 1.5 hours, stand there in the queue, and some people would bring their boria bistar and sleep there overnight, and then book tickets. And that would be announced 2 months ahead in the newspapers. So can you imagine the movement, the transformation that has taken place in the railways and then with the air flight tickets, Travelocity, the cheap ticket, and now TripAdvisor, telling us about the experiences. So we've come really a long way, and fantastic session from you, sir. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Inviting Mr. Bhaskar to give a memento.
Yeah, I'll be here. I know there's not enough time for the Q&A, but any of you can reach out to me. Welcome to
during the lunch session.
Clarify.
Yeah. So thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.